Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Legacy CDPs charge you a premium to keep your data in a black box. RudderStack builds your CDP on top of your data warehouse, giving you a more secure and cost-effective solution. Plus, it gives you more technical controls, so you can fully unlock the power of your customer data. Visit dataengineeringpodcast.com/RudderStack today to take control of your customer data. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Paul Blankley and Ryan Janssen about Zenlytic, a no-code business intelligence tool focused on emerging commerce brands. So, Paul, can you start by introducing yourself?
I'm Paul. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Zenlytic. So I got started doing math and computer science in undergrad. Worked for Roche in their math department for a little bit. Then went on to grad school at Harvard, also in machine learning, which is where Ryan and I met.
And Ryan, how about yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. So glad to be here. My background is I was an engineer in undergrad, and I was an engineer just out of undergrad. But I kind of quickly jumped across to the end user side, I guess. So I moved to the UK, became a VC there, and spent a bunch of time in kind of different kind of analytical roles on the other side of the BI equation. So I was like a data consumer type. Then when I went back to the States, that's when I kind of decided to cross the table and knew I wanted to start sort of being a data practitioner again. And started that by going back to grad school, which is where Paul and I met. And we kind of worked on everything together since then. That was the start of a beautiful friendship.
And going back to you, Paul, do you remember how you first got started working in data?
Yeah, so Ryan and I actually started doing data consulting in grad school. So that was everything from DD on acquisitions to setting up machine learning fraud models, and a big part of what that business became was setting up these analytical stacks. So that's going into companies, everything from seed stage startups to Fortune 100, and helping them set up their analytical stacks, setting up what's effectively called the modern data stack. And that was part of the genesis of Zenlytic, where we realized that the tools were just not keeping up with the rate of change that we saw in AI and the underlying just improvements in the data warehouses. I mean, the performance of Snowflake and BigQuery and their performance just as they've improved over time is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it was quite an exciting place to be, actually. Like when we were doing that work, there was a genesis of several different things. I mean, first it was we were seeing the formation of the modern data stack, right? And we were seeing those tools start to form up. We were seeing the capabilities of warehouses get much faster, and we were seeing the capabilities of at the time it was like the great grandparents of modern large language models. But Paul and I were studying computational data science, and we were working with I guess what were the small language models at the time, and we were watching all those things evolve at a pretty fast rate. And I guess that's what ultimately led us to building Zenlytic. But, watching that and watching the pace was just such an exciting place to be.
And in terms of what you are building at Zenlytic, can you give a bit of an overview about what it is and some of the story behind how you came to this particular problem as the thing that was worth consuming your time and energy and sleep?
Absolutely. I would say the main driver was seeing the changes that we were seeing in AI, coupled with the changes in the modern data stack and the improvements, but just the abysmal lack of adoption inside of the companies we were helping on a consulting basis. So it was just really, really hard for end users of these products to use them. They just wouldn't go in. Like the usage on all these dashboards and on all these, just BI tools is really bad. And it's because no matter how much work you do to try to configure these and set them up and keep things clean, it's just hard to poke around its interface and actually make self-serve work. So our whole goal as a company is to make self-serve truly possible.
And we all have been there, where it's like you're kind of banging your head against the wall as an analytics engineer trying to drive adoption of the tools, right? And it's like, why don't people just use these cool data consumption tools in the end? And that's one of the biggest challenges, actually, working in the field. And I guess our belief, or what we sort of learned in our time doing that, is that a lot of the tools for the end users are really built by data nerds for data nerds, right? And they're actually fairly sophisticated. There's some of them require, a lot of them start with a SQL query, for instance. It's just beyond the capabilities of someone who just is more focused on the domain of their job. They don't want to make understanding and using these tools like a full-time profession. And we just think there's a gap there. We think part of that has been limitations of the tech, right? So like, I think that a lot of tools have been as self-servy as they could be, given the limitations of the tech. So we saw static dashboards at the start because that's as fast as a warehouse could run. The tech has slowly advanced, but I think it's really been like we're almost talking in weeks now, but it's really like the capabilities that are really being unlocked by the sophistication of what we're seeing with large language models. As we know, like the end state for a lot of BI is that driving that adoption usually ends with an email to the data team, and it's like, hey, can you pull this data for me? So like we know that the end state is actually very conversational. It just happens to be with a data analyst or an analytics engineer right now. We're finally starting to see sort of capabilities of the underlying tech that conversational, that interaction can be handled a lot of the time, with a large language model. So that gets us really excited.
And you've mentioned being a consumer of business intelligence tools for various portions of your career. And business intelligence is obviously a very mature and crowded market and has gone through several different generational shifts with different kind of areas of focus. There are business intelligence products for every industry vertical as well as horizontals. And I'm wondering, what was your process for kind of identifying the specific problem that you were focused on solving and some of the ways that you can build a new entrant into this market that would actually stand out and be compelling to the audience that you're focused on?
It's a great question. So I think the big thing is that the big thing that we're focusing on is self-serve, is that you're able to actually have end users answer their own questions as opposed to again, like Ryan said, email the data team. And the main sort of drivers in my opinion of what changes the BI market is when the underlying infrastructure changes. So it's sort of like, you had OLAP cubes way back in the day when, you couldn't really do much else computationally besides OLAP cubes. And then, as technology advances, you have Tableau come in with indexes, and all of a sudden you're able to index this data in memory in Tableau and, have this level of interactivity with it, a higher level of self-serve than was possible with OLAP cubes. Then you have, the data warehouse like Looker and, the data warehouses like Snowflake and BigQuery that Looker sits on top of. And all of a sudden you're able to explore around and, explore from here on a dashboard and actually slice something, by something maybe not on the dashboard. A level of interactivity and a level of self-serve that wasn't previously possible with Tableau. And the main thing that we saw was that the rate of change to AI meant that was going to be the next wave. That was going to be the next, big underlying change that drives, capabilities that were previously not possible in the BI stack. So that's exactly what we're building and what we're taking advantage of to bring that next layer and that next level of self-serve.
The really important thing is that self-serve has always sort of been, the goalposts have moved as to what self-serve actually means, right? I guess the framework that we sort of think about that is like what can be achieved by someone using data tools who doesn't know SQL or Python or someone who would be very technical. And as Paul says, like we moved from like originally it was just basic dashboards all the way through to like more dimensional, some exposure to dimensions and metrics that can be accessed in an easy way. And then the next step for us is self-evident with this conversational technology. I think there's an interesting discussion to be had as well around what needs to happen in the data stack to enable the LLMs as well. That's something we also feel very passionate about, is that these LLMs are very capable of hallucinating and making mistakes. My wife and I were just fooling around with ChatGPT the other night, and they was asking us our bios, and or we were asking it our bios, and it gave a great biography of my wife, and it talked with the whole paragraph about her time at Goldman Sachs and what she did there and her progression and everything very articulately. And my wife has never worked for Goldman Sachs before. So it's, that's really funny when you're sitting at home playing around with ChatGPT. That's catastrophic when you're relying on business, mission critical reporting, business reporting. You can't just make stuff up. So we actually believe that while the large language models are great, like this like text to SQL approach is not the right approach. We think it's necessary to also really think about the semantic layer as an essential tool for enabling this. And it's really like the intersection of these models plus the semantic layer that enable this sort of self-serve paradigm.
As you've mentioned, the what self-serve actually constitutes and who that self happens to be has been a very kind of progressive exploration of what's possible, what's practical, what's pragmatic, and kind of how much effort a given team is willing to put into making that self-serve aspect possible from both directions of the engineering effort to constitute the data stack and set up all of the semantic elements to be able to make data exploration possible and understandable and intuitive for people who don't necessarily have a technical background, as well as the amount of effort that the kind of business users will put in to understand those technical and data semantics versus just saying, as we've been discussing from a conversational perspective, tell me how my sales are doing, because that's not specific enough. Like, which sales, where, why, how, like, even in this conversational mode, there's a level of nuance and kind of background that's necessary for somebody to be able to make effective use of it. And so I'm wondering, before we get too much into like kind of like the semantic modeling and the conversational UI, what are the elements that are coming together now that make you think that you're actually going to be able to effectively deliver on self-serve as everybody thinks it's supposed to mean versus what we've mutated it to mean because this is the limitation of what we can actually do?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing there is actually the conversational component itself. Because exactly what you said, right? It's like, how are my sales doing? And the right response there isn't actually a plot with some arbitrarily chosen like revenue metric. It's, what do you mean? You've got, gross sales, net sales, and then, net profit. Which sales are you talking about? And the person might be like, oh, well, I mean net sales. And then okay, now you can show them the plot. But it's like being able to ask those follow-up questions and being able to push the end user toward what they're actually trying to get to. So it's like a question, like an example that we would see is someone's like, what's my best marketing channel? It's like, well, that's a sort of a loaded question. So you've got to ask clarifying questions and be able to help the end user who's asking the question articulate, what it is they actually want. Because, as a person who's received a lot of these emails asking about data, that is part of what you're doing. Someone's asking about churn and you're able to say, do you mean customers we've completely lost or just subscriber churn? And, just being able to ask those clarifying questions is a really big part of being able to make self-serve possible, because there's never a one-shot answer.
And both sides exist for that too, right? Even if you give the right definition of churn, maybe you didn't specify you wanted it weekly instead of monthly or whatever, right? And like some of the earliest versions of this, actually, when we were still experimenting with the tech before there were, before ChatGPT was a thing, before GPT was a thing at all, and the earliest versions of Zenlytic, it started off with a single question, which is like a good start. But as we all know, as data practitioners, when was the last time someone asked you for a quick data pull and it ended in a single term, right? Almost never. So like that's why we're so bullish on chat, actually, is like the ability to both understand that nuance and context and also, prompt and clarify it on both sides to get the person to the right answer is very, very powerful.
Digging more into that kind of semantic modeling and the kind of upfront investment that's required to be able to actually enable something like a large language model to operate on top of the business context and the kind of domain objects that are necessary to be able to do that data exploration. What are the kind of upfront investments that have to be made before Zenlytic can then actually be used effectively?
So I would say the setup is going to be easier than Looker, but similar in nature right now. So you're going to basically set up views that sit on top of tables. You can define metrics. One of the key differences between us and Looker is that we don't have explorers. You just define primary and foreign keys, and we handle all of the joins basically. So that makes like the setup a little bit easier. But the really, really exciting thing is that we have a recent beta feature that actually lets you have this semantic layer set up, also done by GPT, where you basically say, hey, these are the tables that I want to include. Go and give me basically a first pass. So it's kind of like a superpowered co-pilot for setting up these semantic layers, because they are, everyone who's done this before knows it's a pain to maintain them. It's a pain to set them up. And most of that's just because you're writing this boilerplate LookML or DBT metrics or, metrics and YAML definitions or like whatever it is. And it's a pain. So, we have some AI tooling around making that less of a pain.
And digging more into Zenlytic itself, can you talk a bit about some of the implementation detail, the architecture that you've had to build, some of the kind of internal data modeling that you've had to do to be able to kind of flexibly map these different domain objects into the kind of ML late large language model space, and that translation layer to be able to move from the, very structured, hierarchical, data driven aspect of what we're actually trying to dig into, and the very messy, confused, adaptable, constantly evolving human language space.
Totally. No, it's a great question. The main thing there is being able to have an effective way to serve the context of the semantic layer to the model. Because what the model brings to the equation kind of is like I think about it, like the model brings comprehension. It understands like what the user is asking about very, very well. The semantic layer brings correctness. If you ask for like net revenue by marketing channel, it will never give you a wrong answer. But it's like the intersection of those is actually giving the model the right context, where the model has the ability to look at the semantic layer. And if someone asks for total net revenue over time, it knows about the metric net revenue. It also knows the right date field to choose to trend net revenue over time. And it knows how to apply like the filter last month to that date field to make sure that, the query actually gets executed correctly. So part of what the semantic layer needs to encode is those sort of core gaps that people just speak about colloquially, but have to mean explicit things in the data warehouse. So time being one of the most complicated ones, and one of the ones that we've invested a lot in making sure that we handle correctly.
One important thing to discuss here too is that what we're trying to do, the important part of the semantic layer design is getting to the right primitives. And the primitives for actual sort of like end user consumption, I guess, right? Like essentially those semantic layers are like, it's a translation between data terms and user understandable business terms. And if you get those primitives right, then it becomes much easier for the language models to understand it as well, right? So like those are sort of the stake in the sand, which is where a lot of the magic happens. I think that I think we've collectively as data folks, like we've kind of gotten pretty close to discovering what those right primitives look like, and they're fairly consistent across tools, right? So like metrics and dimensions and filters, and like those sort of primitives are both flexible enough to handle like the necessary cases, but also understandable to the end user and powerful. So like it's a good combination. I guess one area where our approach differs slightly is that we tend to avoid the use of like Paul said, either an Explorer or like a data mart or some sort of end consumption table, in which those cases where if there's a separate metric and if there's a separate sales metric in 3 different sort of data marts, that can also be confusing, right? If there's 5 data marts that have sales in them, that's confusing even if you're a human trying to use semantic layers. So I think one thing that we endeavor to do is actually abstract that part out of the consumption layer. So you don't need to choose a data mart or some set of tables or whatever. You just need to deal with your own metrics, basically. And I think that actually is one of the things that we've been, again, as data people, have been kind of just exploring and flirting with for a while. And it's like we're finally starting to, put that behind the scenes, basically, so that the end users don't need to focus on it.
As far as the kind of evolution of your work and the corresponding evolution of the supporting technologies, I'm wondering how your understanding and implementation of semantic layers has evolved, and some of the necessary substrate that you've had to put in to be able to have an effective kind of representation of those domain semantics so that users can create their own mappings, create their own business objects, but do it in a way that is kind of maintainable from your side without being, a spaghetti mess.
I think the first part of that is not having a concept like Explorers, because having a concept that sort of inherently makes you duplicate joins and stuff leads to code and a semantic layer that's pretty just hard to maintain overall. So not having that concept is super helpful. And I think on the iterative side, there's for sure been things that we've realized, as we've progressed, like, hey, there's a real need for people to be able to do X. So like a good example is, a lot of the times you have metrics actually that span multiple tables that cannot be joined together. You have to basically run those queries and then merge the results at the end, and then create some metric based on like the merging of those results. That's something that we actually built in to the semantic layer to give it the ability to be able to do that. So from the end user's perspective, they can just look at, number of sessions and inventory over time. And there's no reason, like there's no way to join those tables together. You basically just have to aggregate them up by date and, merge the results at the end. So, a feature like that is something that we initially didn't, weren't sure that should be something or that we would need to include in the semantic layer, but there's a huge amount of demand for that ability, and just making it as easy as click instead of figuring out a whole merge results kind of interface.
And the other big philosophy, I think, which is just an overriding concept. It's obvious, but I don't think we do it all the time as data folks. Is just dryness. We endeavor to use software engineering best principles, and in most cases we do. But spaghetti DAGs, one thing that they all have in common is that they generally get pretty wet, right? And like there's lots of repeated code, and there's lots of whatever things are inheriting in multiple places, and that's a hard problem for data folks, because it is like it's a lot harder to make a DAG dry than an application dry. And I think the tools are still evolving in that direction. But that's something that we've always kind of put a pin in, is like, all right, we want this to be as dry as possible. And that's actually kind of been like a North Star for us in design of everything. And I think that simplifies things a lot. I think there's still a long way to go for us and for all tools to really achieve that. But I think as a guiding principle for simplifying the spaghetti, that's probably a good first step.
The other interesting element of this space is the rapid evolution of large language models. And as you mentioned, when you first started this, GPT was either not a thing yet or just barely becoming a thing. Now we're on to ChatGPT 4.5, I think. And obviously there have been kind of exponential leaps and bounds in terms of their capabilities, as well as their capability to, as you said, hallucinate quite in quite detailed fashion, and sometimes quite convincingly. And I'm wondering how that has impacted your overall kind of product approach and some of the additional testing and validation that you've had to do as these language models have become more sophisticated and potentially more problematic.
Totally. I think that's one of the best advantages we get from the semantic layer, actually, because I would be so worried if we had, like GPT-4 generating, SQL statements, because it could be wrong in such sophisticated, like impossible to detect ways. But since we're referencing a semantic layer, if it just comes up with a metric that doesn't exist, the semantic layer can say, hey, that doesn't exist. Error message, you asked about something that doesn't exist. So it's like that hallucination just ends up being like a simple error, as opposed to something that's like catastrophically bad for the business.
I would say that our approach here, especially, I mean, things are changing so fast, and no one knows where they're going to land, or like we're talking day by day into developing. But I think that our approach is plan for the worst and hope for the best. I will say that we're building for current tech. So like nothing in Zenlytic requires an increase in GPT's comprehension capabilities. GPT-5 would be nice, but it's built to work with GPT-4 and stuff that's already been published, basically. If they turned off, the thing that gets me excited is that they turned off the development of all large language model technology today. They did more than a 6-month pause. They did a 6-year pause on that. Even as a software organization, I feel like, Copilot and GPT like have made us as a team, what would you say, Paul? Like at least 25% more productive, right? Like that's just tools that are in the market. So like there's real world use cases happening right now. And we're building for the tech that uses those, we're building for real world use cases that uses the real world tech. If things get better, faster, smarter, that's really just icing on the cake for us.
The other thing I'd add is that it's enabled features that I personally would not have even like dreamed of being possible. Like being able to just point at a bunch of tables and, figure out, with no actual keys, like, okay, what are reasonable joins? What are reasonable metrics? Like what makes sense here? And just being able to have a really good first pass. I mean, it's never perfect, but it's like having the developer tools to be able to just go in and have most of your work done, and you just kind of like tweak a few things. Like I never would have even thought that was possible. And the capabilities of the underlying LLMs are just so strong that, we're able to build features that I wouldn't have even dreamed of before like ChatGPT came out.
I think obviously there's a lot of hype right now, but I think people are still underappreciating the second order effects of this tech. So in traditional software, for instance, you see people tweeting all the time where it's like, yeah, I'm an indie hacker. Like I've always wanted to build these different tools, but I couldn't quite do it from, with my capabilities. But like with GPT, this would have been impossible for me now, and impossible for before. Now I can do it in, a morning. So it's just unlocking all sorts of opportunities for innovation elsewhere just by being such a good coder, for instance. I think we're going to see a lot of similar second order effects that happen when you can make that, really fast build, measure, learn loop possible with great substance. So like I'm just excited about that in general.
In terms of actually onboarding onto Zenlytic, I'm wondering if you can talk through kind of what are the expectations that you have on the customer side as far as, do they have a data warehouse? Are they brand new? They have no idea what they're doing. Like what are the kind of technical capabilities, system capabilities that you're expecting? And then the process of getting somebody onboarded and integrated with Zenlytic to be able to then start actually exploring their data and asking questions.
So all you basically need are credentials for a data warehouse. So we do rely, we support all the major data warehouses, but if you come with credentials for a data warehouse, you can basically put those credentials in and, click this AI deploy button we've been talking about and, make a few tweaks to make sure that things are customized how you need them to be. And you're off to the races. So the implementation comparatively is quite easy. You just come with database credentials.
In terms of database credentials, are you kind of largely assuming that somebody is just, single application, this is their line of business product, you just want to tap into their, application database that's all denormalized, transactional, or are you expecting, we've got everything in our data warehouse, or is it just yes? Either of those, any of those?
It's expecting a data warehouse. So okay. Yeah, definitely expecting data warehouse. So, you can have any data from all these sources loaded in there, but anything that's not in that one data warehouse is going to sort of not be joinable with the other stuff that's in a different area. So if you wanted to do something like that, you'd have to use some sort of distributed query system like a Starburst or something like that, which is not something we are building.
I will say it's cool though. Like one of the things we haven't really talked about, I keep coming back to LLM semantic layer because I'm so excited about it. But one of the neat things is that with a lot of the sort of text to SQL stuff we're seeing, if you read between the lines, it's a toy example, right? It's always a couple of tables, usually one, sometimes a couple of tables that are very, very small, both in rows and columns. The semantic layer makes it possible to actually make queries across an entire data warehouse of arbitrary size, right? It doesn't matter, how complex the tables are, or how much data is in there, or how many metrics you have. As those are all defined in advance, and you can actually have bulletproof confidence in joining and manipulating that data using the semantic layer. So, and that's why we're only warehouse centric. So we don't do any sort of application layer, direct connectivity.
Once somebody is set up, they're using Zenlytic, doing data exploration. I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the typical workflows, and in particular, some of the collaboration aspects of being able to, work across, from data teams to operational teams, across operational teams, within operational teams, some of the ways that data exploration can be kind of made visible across those different roles.
I think the biggest collaboration opportunity actually isn't in our interface or in anyone's interface at all. It's where the team already is. So a lot of the time, for a lot of teams, that's in Slack. So we, have a deep integration with Slack where you can just be in a channel and, be at Zenlytic, like, how has this campaign been doing in the last week? And boom, you get an answer in the thread right there. So one of the things that we've focused on a lot in collaboration is bringing the data to where people already are. Because for, a person who's in the flow trying to, run a new campaign, trying to, send out a new, email newsletter or something, they don't want to go and log into some other tool, no matter how easy it is to use. They want to just stay right where they are and just get the answer they need. That's one of the big things we focus on collaboration-wise, is taking data to where people already are.
One funny thing, like I remember this is a marketing story. I remember a friend of mine who was a marketer said that like a lot of bad marketers assume people wake up and say, "Oh man, I wonder what Coca-Cola is doing today." And in a way, we're kind of collectively guilty of that with BI tools as well. We assume that people are enthusiastic about sort of logging in and configuring and finding the right stuff, in that tool, when in fact they're incredibly distracted with the day-to-day and they just want to get their data right. So like a big part of that collaboration is going to where they are, and where they are happens to be the place where they all are, so they can collaborate together there.
In terms of your engineering effort of building Zenlytic, I'm wondering if you can talk through kind of the proportional effort of dealing with large language models, how that gets deployed into your infrastructure versus managing the kind of semantic layers and helping to expose that to users and deal with some of the kind of edge cases around that, or the kind of UI and chat interface to it. Just kind of what are the areas that have taken the most time versus what your expectations were going into this?
I was going to say the most surprising one was how fast we were able to deploy a lot of the large language model stuff. Especially once you sort of figure out the tooling and you become comfortable with like writing code and writing code in a way that works well with large language models, which is like a little bit of a different skill than writing more, deterministic programs. But it's like once you become familiar with that, like you can push new features and improvements like really fast. That's been surprising for me, just how fast that process has been.
Yeah, I would say the green light is deploying language tech. The yellow light is the semantic layer tech, which is led by Paul and our team. That's a big part of that is like Paul just going mad scientist and locking himself in a room for a week and making a big adjustment to this very sophisticated semantic layering tech. But so that's the yellow light, and I think actually the hardest part, the red light, is probably the user interface design for the BI tool, I would say. And we haven't really talked, about the fact that Zenlytic is also a fully featured BI tool as well, outside of the chat. And so first, just building a BI tool in general takes a tremendous amount of thought and iteration on the UI side. You're taking a very, very complex thing with a ton of boundary conditions, and you're taking a very murky use case with a ton of boundary conditions, and you're kind of the glue that holds those together. And you have to be, simple enough so that the end user will understand, as per our self-serve pig. So UI design is difficult in general, and then we also have the added difficulty of how does that mesh with what people will use or how people will use BI next, and like how does that mesh with the chat, and how do you make it jump back and forth between the chat, and it's kind of challenges on challenges. And I'd say we probably in the development of Zenlytic we probably spent more time on making sure that is really elegant and easy to use than probably just about anything else. Is that fair, Paul? Or
Oh yeah, it's just so hard to make an interface. Take something that's really complex, like a large data warehouse with a bunch of complicated metrics, and make that as palatable and as easy as possible. Where you can just, if you're a non-technical user, just click a few things, and it works how you expect it to. It's shockingly hard to make it just work, basically.
And actually, so like when I was investing as a VC, I come from an era when mobile was actually kind of like the big thing, and there, the companies were winning and losing based primarily on how usable their interface was, right? It was the same thing. People were inventing new designs for mobile, and it had to be very, very simple and straightforward. And that was actually an axis of competition. We've always tried to carry that to Zenlytic and keep things simple and understandable as the Zen, but it's also just a million times harder because you're dealing with such an inherently complex thing like data. It's been an interesting but very fun challenge.
In terms of that kind of business intelligence, user interaction design, being able to have that chat interface so that it's exploratory, but also the more kind of structured, here's a dashboard, here's a set of charts, here's a way to actually dig deeper once you've gotten to a starting point from your conversational aspect, particularly given the focus on self-serve as the default operational mode. What are some of the context clues and kind of guardrails that you've built in to be able to guide people into the pit of success, as it were, in their process of exploring data, where it's, tell me all about all my sales in North Dakota, and then saying, okay, well, what do you mean by sales? Do you mean gross revenue? Do you mean adjusted revenue? Do you mean, total just units sold? And then once you get to some sort of visualization, giving them the context clues, and then particularly given that conversational kind of lead in, are there ways that you're able to pull out the useful kind of semantic elements from that conversation to then add those as labels on or context clues within the graph to be able to say, okay, based on what you're asking, these are the axes that we're going to present to you. These are the kind of grains that we're going to use for you to be able to dig deeper.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the big things. And one feature we have is the summarization. So it's like as you go at asking questions, you'll see like both the plot and then a summary of what's actually going on. Like what's the thing you asked about specifically. So if you asked about a spike over the holidays in traffic or something like that, then that might show you the line with the spike, and then it would also draw to your attention, hey, this is the spike. This is 75% higher than the previous day or something like that. And it helps actually make that understandable. But the other thing that does is that carries that information in the conversation. So as you keep asking questions, like you were mentioning, if you reference something that was kind of a little bit up there, it's still able to be aware of that and to use that as or answering your subsequent questions.
A couple of neat things, just two quick things that came away from some of our user testing throughout our design process. What Paul's alluding to, I think, is that I think the right approach is sort of concise in the inputs, verbose in the outputs, is the way I think about it. We found that people, people like to see more on the way out. Then it's you don't want people to be lost, basically, right? So over communicating is generally good on a feedback basis. And then the input basis, people tend to be, again, busy, distracted, and you want to make that as simple and as clean as possible. One great example of that is early on in our development, we realized people love to sort of paw over their visualizations. And it's funny because this is actually one of those, limitations the tools has shaped the interaction. But it's there's always every BI tool has a visualization library that has its own way of handling clicks and stuff. And it rarely gets translated into very dynamic interactive plots. But we found just watching people click on stuff way more than you'd expect, actually. Our way to sort of address that was with lots and lots of context menus, and very, very smart context menus where people would click on a bar and it's oh, so yes, of course there's a drill option or things like that, or a filter here. You see that we've gotten that far. But we've seen people, they take a line chart and they kind of drag over it to see what happens. And, we pop up a special context menu when that happens saying, do you want to zoom in here? Do you want to explain this particular change? And make sure that all of the steps there are highly contextual. And whether you're doing it in a GUI or in a chat, it's treated like a conversation that guides you to, the next most logical question. You try and anticipate the next steps in that conversation.
And in terms of your experience of building Zenlytic, working with your customers, using it internally to build Zenlytic itself, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen it used?
So I think one of the most unexpected ways for me was when one of our customers was using the explain the change functionality, which usually we've seen people use. It's oh, there's a spike. Why did that thing spike? There's a dip. Why did that thing dip? They were actually using it on a just a flat, no real change, week over week, sales chart. And the reason was that they wanted to be able to see the breakout that inside of even, a week or a month where there's no real major change in the top line number, there's all these reps that did really well, reps that did poorly, reps that, didn't do there's all these changes within the reps, and they were able to zoom in and see, okay, so these customers for this rep aren't actually that healthy despite, the top line number not looking like it moves very much. That was sort of offset by, this other new customer we acquired that went to this rep that did really well. And they were able to, find these drivers of how they can actually improve sales performance and sales efficiency for their reps, even when there's not a major change month to month in their sales numbers. So that was surprising for me. I did not anticipate people using it on flat charts.
Anything else to add?
They used that. I remember that example. They used the word. It's zooming in. It's in biology 201 or whatever, when they give you a microscope and you look at the little slide of water and there's all these little parameciums or whatever, and you're whoa, and there's all sorts of stuff happening sort of just under the surface. It's neat. Even though we call it explain change, it's funny to be used in a flat context. Yeah.
And then given the fact that you're using these large language models as an operational component, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected kind of edge cases or, weird behaviors that you've seen or had to kind of retune around?
Yeah, I'd say one of the big things is just how much even sort of just how much the direction matters, and just when you're actually doing the prompt engineering to get these things to work, and then how much work you have to spend to handle the hallucinations, to handle the weird scenarios where it goes a little bit off the rails, or it doesn't quite do what you expect it to do, and just going through and being able to handle all of those is a different type of programming, kind of. So that's been really interesting because it will go off the rails sometimes and just make stuff up. Format things in ways that you're where did you get this from? So handling those is tricky.
One of the big and most interesting things about dealing with LLMs is you have to throw away a lot of what you know about conventional programming. And like, I'll give you one great example of that is like, obviously a big part of BI is call it like search like functionality, for instance. And in our early sort of prototypes and experiments, the search worked okay until we realized you have to move away from actual search to semantic search, right? And instead of searching for a dimension name, you have to search for slice by this dimension, and in doing that, that actually gives you like a meaningful representation of the way that the LLM thinks. So like there's a whole new paradigm in dealing with these things that kind of defies a lot of conventional logic when it comes to programming.
And in your own experience of building up Zenlytic, growing the business, working with customers, exploring the problem space, and kind of understanding the art of the possible versus what is actually never going to happen, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned personally?
I would say it's a slog to build a BI tool. There's so many small features, permissioning, like all the roles, and just there's so many features in there to build. So it's a lot. It's a slog.
There's like an old joke in VC where it's like don't build an ERP tool. It's like building like a second railroad next to an existing railroad. Like it's there's so much that goes into it, and I would actually extend BI to that category as well. So some days I get jealous of people who are just building CRUD apps where they have like a single well structured table that they're kind of reading and writing to. And a BI tool is a whole other beast for sure in that regard. And there's a lot of different edge cases and there's a lot of considerations, and they're all very very closely related. So like again, same thing. You want to change a feature for reasons of interface design, that's good. But then also, how's that going to impact governance? How does that impact composability of the semantic layer? And like this, everything sort of links together. It's a challenging build, but it's really really rewarding when it comes together.
And for people who are looking for that holy grail of self-serve business intelligence, what are the cases where Zenlytic is the wrong choice?
So I'd say like the first one is if you're, fine with the off-the-shelf tools. If those get the job done, if you're not, feeling that much pain from this. So for instance, if you have a Shopify dashboard and Google Analytics, if that's getting the job done for you or close enough to getting the job done, then there's no reason to pay for the extra tools. There's no reason to use us, basically. And then the other one that I'd add too is if you're writing Python, if you're training ML models, if you're, using pandas for this kind of stuff. We're also not the tool for that. You could use a notebook like a just Jupyter or Hex or one of the notebook solutions out there.
As you are continuing to iterate on and grow and evolve Zenlytic, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term, or kind of particular projects that you're excited to dig into, or evolutions in the LLM and semantic space that you're keeping an eye on?
So I think one of the most exciting ones for me is more and more tooling around making management of the semantic layer just super easy. I think that's one of the biggest kind of gaps now, and that's one thing that we'll be pushing a lot of features in, and one thing I'm super excited about.
When I have chats with other data practitioners, I often find myself going back to what I say is like the biggest problem in the modern data stack today, which is it's legitimately more work to maintain and build these tools, right? And like the rise of analytics engineering as a profession is because of that added complexity of the tools, and there's tremendous benefits, right? So like of course you get powerful customization, flexibility, you get everything just exactly the way the business needs it, but there are also trade-offs. So like, and with those trade-offs there's actually rationales for like those off-the-shelf tools that Paul alluded to, right? So like there is a time and place for those. There, the modern data stack does not dominate those because those are deployable in a few clicks, and you can have decent analytics with less investment. So like I have a hunch that over the past few years we've built up all this incredible power and complexity, and I think that the next step for the modern data stack is we're going to start to invert that pyramid and find ways to streamline this and make it easier to maintain, easier to deploy, easier to build. And I'm guessing, I don't exactly know what that is. If it's more use of templates, I think it's deploying, better use of AI to automate what's possible to automate with the construction of, a data configuration. I think there's lots of ways we can go with it, but I think that going forward, this is kind of, the watershed moment is when we increase the accessibility of these tools as well.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing at Zenlytic, this overall space of self-service business intelligence, the impact and opportunities for semantic layer improvements, the use of large language models and kind of AI more generally in the path of data generation and consumption that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think that's pretty much it. The only thing I'd say is that, it's really the intersection of LLMs and the semantic layer that make this possible. That this just, it doesn't get done with text to SQL. The hallucination problem is just too much. And even if it's not hallucinating, these definitions vary from company to company. And then the semantic layer by itself is just too complicated for end users, like business users, to navigate. You really need the combination of LLMs and the semantic layer to make self-serve truly possible.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as the final question, I'd like to get your perspectives on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I would wholeheartdy agree with what Ryan was saying about the just how complicated it is to manage a semantic layer. So I think we're still in the early innings of finding out what good looks like there, but I completely agree with Ryan. That's one of the biggest problems overall for managing data.
I'll revisit that. And just I think I call that the most important problem in the modern data stack. I think there's a lot of really talented people who are working to address that right now as well. So I think that'll be quickly solved. I'll add the second thing, which I think is important, is going back to usability and self-serve. We all know Looker coined, the data bread lines as a term. That's still a very real pain. We know that end users want to be more data driven in the way that they sort of think and act. I feel like they have not been given due consideration in the modern data stack yet. I think a lot of tools have been built by data people for data people, whether it's, and that's also why we have all sorts of observability tools. That's a very important problem, but for some reason we haven't really focused on the needs of how people are going to use this data to improve the way that they do their jobs. So I think addressing stuff is important. I think right now, if you're a non-technical end user, your choices are to spend a bunch of time, grogging around in a spreadsheet, which is time-consuming and very, very brittle and very, very inconsistent, or to ask a data team, which is quite often, a bunch of iterations that take so long that your question is a rearview mirror and not really actionable. Or the third situation, which is probably the most common one, is you just don't use data. You use your gut, you go finger in the air, and you say, yeah, I think it's probably this. And I think that if you're doing that, you're missing out on tremendous opportunities to be better at your job. I'd say that's the second most important problem is making sure that self-serve users or the end user is actually getting access to the data and analytics that they need.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at Zenlytic. It's definitely a very interesting product, interesting problem space. It's great to see some of the ways that AI is kind of coming full circle, where it used to be it was just the thing that you did at the end, and now it's actually part of the beginning work. So it's definitely exciting to see kind of how that evolves. So appreciate the time and energy you're putting into that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.